So good morning from Washington, D.C. My name is Jeff Payne. This is the newest iteration of NESA's, the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies Maritime Security Series. Most of the previous iterations of this event have focused on the Indian Ocean region and its eastern components. So South Asia, the Bengal, Southeast Asia, and so forth. Today we're getting into the northwestern reaches, an area that is often seen as exempt from the larger Indian Ocean, and that is the Gulf. For those of you who know, the Gulf is an insanely complicated security environment. It's an insanely complicated economic environment, and is geopolitically critical for the entire world, even if a country does not receive most of their energy supplies from that region. So everything from pricing to the flow of commerce is dependent upon the flow of oil and natural gas coming out of the Gulf region. So joining me today is one of my distinguished colleagues from the NESA Center, David Des Roches, who is a retired colonel from the U.S. Army. We will not hold that against him. He is an expert on the Gulf in various capacities, everything from looking at the issue of missile defense systems to traditional security standoffs, regional rivalries, as well as the politics and the strategy of the Gulf itself and how it is used by various actors. So I asked Dave before we joined, before this session began, to answer a specific question, and he has some slides to help with that answer, and that is this question: how do regional rivalries in the Gulf play out in the maritime domain? So either in the coastal context or in the larger littoral areas. So Dave, with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to you. I will share your slides, and the microphone is now yours, my friend.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate it. Thanks for that kind introduction. I was an Army guy, but I also enlisted in the U.S. Navy. I never actually served because I decided to go to the military academy instead. But so I have a kind of a naval thing. This is my contact information. I don't. My remarks do not represent U.S. government policy. If you follow me on Twitter, I post a lot of studies and government documents that might be of interest to you. So, for example, the Department of Defense assessment of Chinese military power that just came out, I tweeted that out a few days ago, and you might find it to be a useful resource. I intend to just present a couple of thoughts here, mostly about Iran's way of doing war, because quite frankly, the Arab states of the Gulf, either their navies are really just coastal defense forces. Their navies are not viewed as aspects of power projection. They don't really have a coherent naval strategy for the most part. Usually their navies are the least influential of their services, and they just do them because they think they should have one. So it's reflexive, and really when you look at the strategy and the intellectual thrust of warfare or preparation for warfare in the Gulf, the Iranians drive the train. So next slide, please. When we think about naval warfare, we think about, this, ships facing off against ships and duking it out, like the Spanish Armada, or here the Battle of Jutland. Next slide, please. Historically, we look at something like Jutland, where you have forces that are almost identical, that basically try to maneuver against each other to achieve an advantage. That's not what we're looking at here. We're not looking at peer-to-peer symmetric warfare between like navies. Next slide, please. So we're looking at asymmetric naval warfare, and normally that refers to something like blockade runners. So the ship on the upper left is the Confederate States ship Advance, which was a blockade runner in the American Civil War. The Union forces imposed a naval blockade around the southern states, what was called the Anaconda Plan. And basically, the naval engagements consist of blockade runners like this trying to go through to carry out. Or we think of something like the ship on the lower right-hand corner, also from World War I. This is the German ship Scharnhorst, which, again, was engaged in basically running the British naval blockade and sinking that. But that asymmetric warfare actually is not even apropos for the Iranian model, which is based on a far weaker concept. Next slide, please. What we're looking at in Iran is not peers, but things like small ships and mine torpedoes. such as this small, fast patrol boat, attacking not against military targets, but rather attacking against civilian targets. So it's not really designed to carry on commerce illicitly. It's designed to completely shut down commerce for Iran as well as for Iran's adversaries, who are the Arab states of the Gulf. And this is based on some fundamental assumptions in Iranian strategic culture. The first one of which is that if maritime traffic, commercial traffic, is shut down completely, Iran will suffer, but its Arab adversaries will suffer far more, and Iran is much more able to withstand the suffering than the Arab thing. So they will win not by carrying on commerce illicitly, not by running blockades, not by defeating the Arab state navies or the U.S. navies. They will do it by basically causing commercial commerce to stop. Next slide, please. And so they do that through these asymmetric things, such as these are small boats. This is the Ashura class fast attack craft, which is basically a Boston whaler, a small patrol boat, but each of which has rails that have mines on it. And these mines are not much different from the mines that were used, again, in World War I. Indeed, in the 1980s, some of the mines that were recovered that had been planted by the Iranians were actually early Imperial Russian mines that had been in storage for years. And again, not very effective against modern navies, but the target is not modern navies. The target is commercial shipping. Next slide, please. So when we look at Iranian strategic culture, my friend Mike Eisenstein, who works here in Washington and who has frequently lectured at NESA, he wrote a really short encapsulation of the Marine Corps University. This is the title of it. I'll send the links to Jeff if any of you want to read it. But basically, he's distilled Iranian strategic culture for all the armed forces of Iran, but it applies very well to the naval forces. Next slide, please. I'm sorry for giving you a text here, but basically what he talks about, these are two of his core elements, is that unconventional approaches to deterrence and defense, and that sort of shapes the Iranian preference for attacking commerce, the molding of hard and soft power, and the primacy of the spiritual, moral, and psychological dimensions of statecraft and strategy. And the way that distills into the naval threat is that the Iranians, quite frankly, believe that their Arab adversaries are decadent, don't have the stomach for conflict, are not used to fighting for themselves, that they basically will expect the United States to, in the West, to bail them out of any serious naval conflict, and that if commercial shipping is disrupted, which is all of their external trade and a great part of vital internal trade like food, none of the Arab states of the Gulf are capable of feeding themselves, that Iran can weather this and they can't. And so then you look at their way of war, the two elements at the bottom. You avoid a direct conflict. And basically what you try to do is deny access to others indirectly, avoiding it. So it's somewhat related to an anti-accessorial denial, but it's done indirectly, and it's done in a way that hopefully would minimize attribution. Next slide, please. Distilling this further is this pamphlet on the right, which is written by me. And basically, I looked at how Iran fights in all the domains, so land, air, and basically what I said is that the West, which includes the Arab states, NATO, and the United States, which is the ultimate guarantor of naval security in the Gulf, we have to dominate to achieve our strategic goals. We have to make the Gulf as safe for shipping as a suburban parking lot here in the United States. For Iran to achieve it, all they have to do is disrupt it. And they do that through proxy attacks, disrupting shipping, and taking hostages. And they have done this across the way. So that British tanker or freighter that I showed earlier, the Stena Imperial, that was taken hostage for Iran in order to achieve their goals. In this instance, the release of an Iranian ship that was defying EU sanctions to bring oil to Syria. Next slide, please. This slide comes from Vice Admiral John Miller, who formerly commanded U.S. naval forces in the Gulf. What he does is he looks at Iran's stacked threat. So basically, they're not looking at a direct military conflict because they know they'll lose that. So they look at the major sea lanes, which are marked in gray here, and say, look, for us to achieve our goals, all we have to do is disrupt those sea lanes. Not naval, but rather commercial. And so they start at the top with missiles. The brown lines represent the range of various Iranian anti-ship missiles. So you can see that almost all of the Gulf. And so you use ballistic missiles, anti-ship missiles, small boat attacks, innovative naval things such as small submarine attacks and high-speed torpedoes, and then finally mines. And so going from that high attributable threat to a low, difficult to attribute threat, all of this creates disruption, and again, would not deter or defeat a determined Navy, but will cause commercial shippers to raise their insurance rates, lower their ability to carry cargo versus their ability to have protection, and basically just gum up the works for everybody. Next slide, please. So let's start with ballistic missiles. This chart shows each of Iran's inventory of ballistic missiles. Not quite as significant as one might think, because while these missiles have great range, they don't have great accuracy. And of course, the range for range without accuracy is perhaps acceptable in terror attacks against cities, but a discrete target like a ship, not so useful. However, bear in mind, to disrupt the Gulf, they're not operating at maximum range; they're operating at short range. And if they fire 40 of these missiles, that are relatively inaccurate, they still will be effective against ships, particularly if they're shooting at commercial ships. Next slide, please. This is the newest Iranian ballistic missiles. It was just unveiled this month, and it's called the Qasem Soleimani, Martyr Qasem Soleimani. Sorry, my Farsi is a little bit old. Martyr Qasem Soleimani ballistic missile. It claims to have a range of 1,400 kilometers, which is significant. But what's even more significant, you see how it's tapered towards the end, and then the nose cone has its own fins. The Iranians claim that this has a circular probability error of 5 meters, which means that if they fire 100 of these missiles at a target, 50 of those targets will land within 5 meters of their desired target. That, if true, is an extreme increase in accuracy and means that this ballistic missile would be accurate enough to be an effective anti-ship weapon. Now, is this true? We don't know, and the reason why we don't know is because in the past the Iranians have trotted out at weapons shows, and as you can see, this is a weapons show. They've trotted out missiles that they claim to have built, and they haven't done it. They've had test fires of missiles, and then they've altered the photos to show more missiles taking off than is the case. The nose cone of this, complete with the fins, suggests that it is an accurized nose cone. However, if you look at the back, you will see that the rocket has 8 tail fins. And normally when you look at ballistic missiles, they have 4 tail fins. In the case of, for example, the Korean Nodong, or they have no tail fins in the case of the Iranian Qiyam, which is the missile that the Iranians have been launching via their Houthi proxies from Yemen at Riyadh. 8 indicates that there's a lot of instability as the rocket motor burns out. And so if the rocket lacks the stability in flight to get close enough to the area where, the nose cone, which is not propelled, where it has to, ballistically hit the target, that would indicate that it wouldn't be that accurate. But be that as it may, technology is advancing all the time, miniaturized electronics. Sooner or later, the Iranians will have the capability to probably achieve an accuracy range on ballistic missiles that's suitable for attacks against ships. Next slide, please. At the same time as the Martyr Qasem Soleimani ballistic missile was released, they also released this one, which is called the Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes cruise missile. Of course, Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes was the Iraqi militia commander who died with Qasem Soleimani. This is a variant, reverse engineered and improved variant of the KH-55 Russian cruise missile, and it probably has value as a specifically anti-ship cruise missile. What's interesting about this is it's got a solid motor. As you see, it has a booster rocket on the back, which would indicate enhanced range. And, excuse me. It's supposed to be canister launched, so it can be launched. They showed a demonstration, which they said was of it being launched from land, but it could conceivably be mounted aboard ships. I don't know why, because the Iranians, don't really need to do that, given that they occupy one entire side of the Gulf. But what it shows is a sort of incremental improvement on the reverse-engineered KH-55 cruise missiles, so that if they are not already accurate enough to threat ships, They will be soon. And of course, they are already accurate enough to threaten commercial shipping. Next slide, please. This shows the range of existing, this comes from the Defense Intelligence Agency's current report on Iranian naval capabilities. And these are currently deployed Iranian anti-ship missiles are known to exist in the inventory. So if you basically, we took Iranian territory and drew maximum ranges around that. So they're not necessarily covering all of this, but this is the area that they have the potential to reach. So as you see, even with existing capabilities, they do have the ability to reach the entire Gulf. Next slide, please. And large portions of the Arabian Sea. The UN weapons sanctions on Iran are due to expire shortly. The talk is, will this have any impact? Because Iran, of course, doesn't have a lot of money, has a lot of things that it needs money for. What are they going to buy? And of course, Iran does have a nascent strategic agreement with China, where they are going to provide oil to China. So the question is, what are they going to get in return? And one area that I think is ripe for that the Iranians might actually be interested in buying weaponry would be in China's anti-access aerial denial missiles. The reason for this is that China or Iran can already pretty effectively deny most of the Gulf if they have to, but only at great cost to Iran. If they were to increase their capability, say with the DF-21 missile, which you see just below the line there in the intermediate range ballistic missile, then that would allow the Iranians conceivably to be able to attack large targets such as the U.S. aircraft carrier in the Arabian Sea, not in the Gulf, and it would be able to attack them beyond the range that the aircraft on the aircraft carrier would be able to move. So it could be conceivably be an effective anti-access aerial denial weapon. So this is one area that I think the Iranians might consider buying Chinese weapons. The Chinese may actually deny these sales to the Iranians, not necessarily out of any altruistic motives, but rather because, as we've seen with the KH-55 and most of the Iranian ballistic missiles, particularly the early ones, are reverse engineered copies of Scuds bought from Russia or North Korea. And so the Iranians have proven to be adept at reverse engineering missiles and other weapons. So if the Chinese sell these things to the Iranians, they'll have a successful sale once, and then within about 5 years, they'll start to see things that look like copies of them. So they might decline to provide these weapons just on commercial grounds. Next slide, please. This is how Iran organizes itself for war. So the blue represent Iranian Ministry of Defense forces. The red represent the Revolutionary Guard forces. Iran has not just two armies, but two parallel armed forces. So the Revolutionary Guard has an army and an air force. Generally, the Revolutionary Guard is better funded. It's self-funded because they have a lot of activity in a lot of economic activity in the Iranian state, monopolies and businesses, money that is kept off the books, a budget. So they have more modern equipment. The Navy is not insubstantial by standards of the Gulf, but the real most of the conflict comes from the Revolutionary Guard. So the bases in red are what's of importance there. Next slide, please. Now looking at the Strait of Hormuz, this is obviously the greatest point of impact and the greatest point of interest. So a significant portion of the world's hydrocarbon energy transits this. If this was closed, it would be a disaster for countries of East Asia, such as Japan, Korea, China, just because they're so reliant on oil that transits it. We all know it's narrow, but what's important to note here is that the actual shipping, which are represented by the blue arrows, are even more narrow. And indeed, it's, the shipping lanes themselves are dredged. So if you were to fly over this, you would see ships waiting to transit, not unlike a canal or an even narrower strait like the Bosphorus. So in order to deny this, it's a much easier task than is commonly assumed. Also, unconventional things such as torpedoes or small submarines, because you have differences in salinity and water temperature rushing through that strait, traditional naval means used like sonar and hydroacoustics, they are not as effective in the strait because you're going between different temperatures and stuff like that. So it's a little bit easier to disrupt shipping here than even is commonly thought. And of course, that big island there, Qasem Island, is loaded with Iranian naval bases and military capacity. Next slide, please. This shows one example of that. This is from the summer before last, when you had an Iranian campaign carried on against merchant shipping, and it culminated in an Iranian shoot-down of a U.S. Navy drone, which Iran claimed overflew territorial waters, which the United States said was international waters, and quite frankly caught the United States surprised, because they were used to overflying international waters with impunity. But basically, Jeff will make this available to the group. This is the U.S. Navy storyboard that shows how these ships were basically mined by Revolutionary Guard navies, and then after the explosions went off, seized by the Revolutionary Guard under the pretext of, this is a ship in distress. Next slide, please. And again, this shows the moving in of the Revolutionary Guard small boats, which affix the mines. And you can see in the upper right-hand corner, it's a photograph from a U.S. Navy helicopter showing naval magnetic limpet mines. They have magnetic suckers, then they're bolted on, being placed on the ships. Next slide, please. And here you see damage caused by the limpet mines. This is on the Kokura Courageous. And of course, one of the mines did not explode. You can see it on the right. Now, these were affixed above the waterline. Obviously, if you want to sink the ship, you do it below the waterline. So there's, again, a strong political messaging component in these actions, and it was basically designed to say, look, you cannot, clamp down sanctions, stop our trade without cause to you. So if our trade ceases, everybody ceases, and you will be damaged more by it than we will. Next slide, please. This is film taken showing, one of the mines failed to explode. This was an Iranian Revolutionary Guard boat that then went there to try to retrieve the mine, because it was, obviously evidence. They didn't want it directly traced back to Iran, so they approached quickly to try to retrieve that limpet mine. Next slide, please. And they were mostly successful, but one of the pads they were unable to remove. So you can see here the outline of the mine that was retrieved, and the attaching pads, but again, one of them they just couldn't, and so that remained in place there. Next slide, please. This is the stern of the Saudi ship Mecca. This was not in the Gulf. This was on the other side in the Red Sea, and it was basically attacked by a remote-controlled boat that was called the Shark 22. This is a Revolutionary Guard guidance system that takes a modified small fast boat. They take the warhead off of a Styx anti-ship missile, which was the standard Soviet-era anti-ship missile. The Styx was the first missile to actually destroy a ship in the 1967 war between Israel and Egypt. But the missile deteriorated, liquid-fueled missile deteriorated, seals deteriorated. The Houthis, under Iranian direction, took the warhead off the missile, put it in the boat, and then applied a Revolutionary Guard designed guidance system with servo motors to remotely guide the boat into the stern of the ship, leading to this damage. And honestly, I'm not sure if the Mecca has been repaired or not, if it's ever gone back to sea. I'm sorry, Medina. Next ship slide, please. This shows how that boat goes. These are photographs taken of one of these sharks, which was captured, and you can see the schematics there, how it's got the various radio communication guidance systems, servo motors that control it, and then it's got multi plunger detonators, which are in the bow of the boat, operated in 4 directions. So basically, you can have an operator on it that goes to within a certain distance, and the operator jumps overboard, the ship's operator remotely. And at the bottom center, you can see the computer terminal that actually provides the remote guidance controls. So it can be controlled by a radio link or a cell phone link. And of course, it's got cameras for visual and all that. Or you could modify it for GPS, although that would be useful against a static target. Next slide, please. This is kind of interesting. So this was taken from the shark. Every time it's turned on, the motor guidance, it takes a picture. So one of these was captured, and this was the first picture on its memory, which is at a factory in Tehran, a Revolutionary Guard factory. And you can see the picture it took was of 2 of the technicians working on it in a workshop that is loaded with these guidance modules. And you can see here that the guy had his hat with the Revolutionary Guard Military Industries logo on it. So pretty certain as to where this comes from. This picture was actually presented to the UN Security Council in December of 2017, along with the elements of the missiles that had been captured or that impacted at Riyadh International Airport, and some of the drones that had been captured in Yemen and southern Saudi Arabia. Next slide, please. Then moving down the stack of threats, we have swarming of small boats. The small boats are based on commercial design. You see here we have the upper picture is the factory where the boats are produced. Initially, the small boat designs were, they bought boats from Sweden that were designed as sport fishing boats, and they basically just modified that using fiberglass. On the upper hand corner, you see a slightly different model leaving the factory. And then in the bottom is a picture taken from a U.S. Navy ship showing a number of these this summer where they swarmed the U.S. ships, although they primarily went around a Coast Guard, a U.S. Coast Guard vessel, knowing that it didn't have quite the same level of weaponry as a U.S. Navy ship. Next slide, please. So they're not stupid. Then we move down to mines, and these are the standard, some of the standard techniques to lay mines. So they have covert laying of mines, and here you can see this was a ship that was disguised as a fishing ship, which had cut out oil drums, and then beneath it were mines. So it's a covert mine layer. And then a Revolutionary Guard Navy patrol boat that had 4 mines on a mine railing rail rather, and this would just go out into shipping lanes as close as possible to commercial shipping lanes, and then just shoot out mines. And of course, mine laying is a very, very effective, cost-effective technique. It costs almost nothing to put mines out there. It is exponentially more difficult to clear mines, because once a mine is out there, particularly for commercial shipping, there's no such thing as cleared. What you talk about are confidence intervals and things of that nature, so it just doesn't do it. Next slide, please. So I've gone quick and dirty through that. I hope you found it useful, and I welcome your questions. Jeff?
Thank you, Dave. A lot of data there. And anyone who is interested, who's watching the video on those slides, you can reach out to me, and we can make them available to you. But Dave, to ask you some follow-up questions. I'm going to return back to the beginning of your statements.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned that, can you go into more detail about the Arab Gulf states not really having navies? Because the thing that for the naval community around the world that seems super perplexing is the fact that the wealth and stability of all of these states relies upon seaborne trade. Their entire way of life is dependent upon those commercial shipping lanes. So under what logic is it that these countries do not prioritize coastal defense, littoral defense, and stand up whether either be adequate navies or adequate coast guards? Can you get into the kind of the logic of how they're thinking about defense?
Yeah, good question. So so there's a whole field of study on ineffectiveness of Arab militaries. Some of it comes from a place of love, and some of it doesn't. So one of the explanations is that when you look at Arab militaries in general, they're not really there to fight wars the way that, say, Western militaries are. They're there as coup-proofing. So, why does Saudi Arabia have an army and a National Guard? And the answer is, if you just have an army, then the commander of the army can take over, but the National Guard is there to protect the regime. If you subscribe to this school of thought, then a navy is pretty much irrelevant in coup-proofing, because they're out at sea, they're on a port, so they always get shortchanged from that. The second context of it is that you can kind of fake it with an army. An army, as long as you got a lot of guys and they're marching and they look good, it's hard to tell. It's hard to take an instant measure of how good or bad an army is. So they can look good. Air forces, you spend a lot of money training pilots, and you can contract out your maintenance, and you can always have planes flying. Ships, on the other hand, are very, very hard. And even a country, you know, as effective as the United Arab Emirates, which is considered to have the most effective military among the Arab states, you know, a lot of their ships are crewed by foreigners. So when the HSV-4, which was a high-speed hydrofoil that had been rented by the U.S. Navy for some time, then transferred to the Emiratis, when it was hit by a missile, we found out that the captain was a Pole, the first mate was Ukrainian, and a lot of the crew were Filipinos. It's just hard, technical, not skills there. And then finally, you know, if you take an objective look at your security considerations, it's kind of like, well, you know, there are very few navies in the world that are capable of really projecting power in blue seas. Most navies in the world are really coasts or coastal defense forces. So this idea of going out and defending sea lanes, you know, why should you know, the countries that buy oil and the United States, which is committed to global free trade, you know, they have a big investment. They have a seafaring tradition. You know, why should we waste, and even for these rich forces, once you get into the government, you know, money is scarce. Why should we risk scarce resources for something that somebody else is more interested in than we are? So it just gets underdeveloped. And in all of the armed forces of the Arab world, the Navy is the least influential and least well-funded of their services, always.
Well, thanks. That provides some contextual details, and it leads to my second follow-up, because your presentation was amazing in providing details on the kind of traditional security realm. How serious do any Gulf states, whether it be Iran, which has, I would think, based upon your presentation, a different mindset when it comes to projecting power in the region, versus Arab Gulf states, how seriously do non-traditional security threats factor in? Are these niche issues for these countries, or are there some that are specializing in specific things? Like, you know, everything from, there's long been rumored, and this is from the maritime space, concerns over Arab Gulf states being ports of exit for all sorts of illicit antiquities trading. And then on the Iranian side, a ton of Iranian commercial vessels have been used as smuggling for narcotics, arms, and even human trafficking for years. So are these just not things that factor in, or if they do, how do they factor in? If you could provide your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, that's a really good question. So in general, almost every country in the world, when they look at border control, they put more attention to things going in than things going out. So you know, when I was at the Department of Homeland Security in 2009, we had a plus up of the U.S. border, where we brought in soldiers from the National Guard to support border controls. And what was unique about it, what was not known by almost any Americans at the time, they were not screening cargo going in. It was there to support the Mexican president, screening cargo going out to make sure that firearms weren't being exported into Mexico, which, of course, you know, struck me as kind of foolish at the time, given that the southern border of Mexico is where a lot of your heavy firearms, military equipment comes in. But it was basically political support. So the Arab states, with their customs regime, they tend to focus more on stuff coming in than stuff coming out. Some of these countries have almost a tacit understanding that other countries' problems are other countries' problems, and we're focused on ourselves. So, for example, if you look at the Financial Action Task Force, compliance with international standards on money laundering, some of the Arab Gulf states score particularly poorly. The Economist 2 weeks ago ran a long section on Dubai, and they basically said that, look, if you look at all the major financial centers in the world, London, New York, Hong Kong, et cetera, Dubai is up there, but Singapore. Dubai is the only one that scores very poorly for financial action task force compliance. So I think that carries on into smuggling as well. And yeah, I think if you talk to any of these guys, you know, their number one priority from smuggling is probably prevention of narcotics coming in, and antiquities going out would be way down the list. I don't even know if they have a specialized unit, and certainly only in countries like Italy and maybe Egypt that you see specialized anti-antiquity smuggling unit.
Fair enough. That provides some context because it is something that routinely is discussed about.
Yeah.
So let's focus on your presentation regarding Iran.
Okay.
The nascent China-Iran deal is talked about frequently, and we don't yet know if it's for sure or not. But one of the things that I found particularly fascinating is that if that leaked report that it's based upon is accurate in any way, shape, or form, the port of Jask is specifically mentioned as a target of Chinese investment, and obviously it's already used for the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. It's already used as a naval station for the Iranian naval forces. And then the whole idea is Jask will be prioritized as a hub for natural gas, heavy mineral, and petroleum distribution. And so therefore Iran could, in essence, in the long run, bypass the Gulf altogether. You mix this in with Chabahar. So in that situation, and this is purely speculative, but based upon your experience, would that fuel greater aggression on behalf of Iran, or would that eliminate the need for some of its aggression? I've heard arguments both ways. So where do you fall on that idea?
Yeah, good question. So a couple things. So first off, Iran's not the only country to try to bypass the Strait of Hormuz constriction. So the UAE has a port in Fujairah. Of course, Oman, all of their ports are on the Indian Ocean side. There's been pipelines constructed from Abu Dhabi to Fujairah. There's talks of trying to get pipeline, all of Oman's exports go there, but Oman's not really a major petroleum exporter. And Saudi Arabia has pipelines that go to their ports at Mecca, Yanbo, places like that. But the problem is then you have to go through the Bab el-Mandeb and Suez Canal. So you're still kind of constricted. Let me back off and you're the Chinese expert, but honestly, conceptually, I regard every Chinese vessel and every Chinese entity as under the influence, if not the command, of the Chinese Communist Party. So every commercial Chinese ship, my understanding is a member of the Chinese informal naval militia. So it's kind of if there's a major Chinese presence at a commercial port, then it is at least a contingency military port. Although right now, Trump have made a quite wise decision saying if the Americans are paying for our oil export security, why should we mess with that? Iran would be very happy to have a major exporting port that doesn't bypass the Strait of Hormuz because it knows that its adversaries, its Arab adversaries, cannot duplicate that capability. So then they could shut shipping completely, not suffer, still continue to export. And again, they believe in their own moral superiority and the toughness of their population, the ability to withstand sanctions, which they've demonstrated over decades. So they think that they will stand by, be hardy, while they think the Arabs will fold. If their Amazon shipments take an extra week to arrive. If the chocolate fountain at the Ritz-Carlton in Abu Dhabi is turned off, then they think they'll capitulate completely. So that is a strategic game changer. But there are problems. I mean, it requires significant infrastructure to reorient their pipelines, their commercial shipping to Jask from where it is now. The longer you have to move product overland, the greater costs are involved. And right now, the price of oil would not sustain it. I mean, it's only in an economy that's distorted by sanctions would you consider it to be worthwhile to do it. And quite frankly, the value is not there. So Iran would be exporting this at a severe loss. Right now, oil is, I think, $40 a barrel. It's not going to get to $100 a barrel. And so, particularly given the sanctions, on Western technology exports and the kind of equipment that's needed to build that network of pipelines, refineries, stuff like that, they're not going to get that. They're not going to get that in a cost-efficient manner. And by the time they build it, the demand may not be there. So it's really only possible if you consider it as a security investment. If you consider something as a security investment, then people will do things that the economic cost benefits doesn't pencil out at. But economically, it's not going to work out. Sorry, that's kind of a rambling answer, but I covered a lot of ground there. Yeah.
But that's helpful. I mean, it provides the kind of the landscape. Yeah. Kind of a final question, because you addressed a lot of the issues I had about, like, the missile systems and how they're used to project in the Gulf. This is for specifically audiences that are from the Indian Ocean region at large, who may or may not have trade relations with the Gulf to a certain degree, and they want to know, how would you explain to them, or how would you convince them that things happening in the Gulf are a part of their region,
right, and
B, are something that they should care about? Because for them, it's like, okay, the Americans are there doing their thing in securing trade routes. The Iranians are going to harass the Gulf states. The Arab Gulf states are going to continue to export oil and build up their own kind of national defense forces. The British might play, the French might play occasionally. The Chinese are going to avoid. Why, as say India or Indonesia, or even Madagascar or Seychelles, why should we care?
Yeah, good question. And the short answer is economics are what really drives it. And I mean, we're in the middle of the pandemic, so all of these countries, every country along the Indian Ocean exports labor and is dependent on remittances from its citizens who are working in the Arab Gulf states. So if as we saw with COVID, where plane loads of Filipinos being expatriated from the Arab Gulf states countries, and this is India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, big Philippines. All of these countries have been very, very hard hit. Kenya, very hard hit by people working there who've had to go home. And the incidental tourism, a lot of the profit in the tourist industry in places like Mauritius, Seychelles, those are people coming from the Arab Gulf. Those are people coming from the Arab Gulf states. So if that commerce is then they suffer, and they suffer big, because this is disposable income that comes over. It's not income for trade. It's not income that comes with a cost. By and large, it's just money coming in exchange for investments that have already been made. So that's vital money that comes at a relatively low effort that just goes away. So that cripples it. The second thing is the energy markets. The oil from the Gulf doesn't come to the United States, and increasingly doesn't go to Europe. It's going to the Indian Ocean region, and there aren't really viable sources there other than the Gulf that are big exporting. It's not going to be replaced by tar sands oils coming out of Canada across the Pacific. That is the cheapest oil. I know economists have done little things where they track, for example, upticks in Arabian Peninsula oil and correlate with increases death rate in India. India has no oil. So these are vital interests, and just as we saw in 2009 the sort of what was called the slow motion tsunami, where food prices went up, and if oil prices go up, every other price follows it. If we see a disruption, then we could see that kind of increase in starvation, malnutrition. It's indirect, but it is definitely it's not indirect. It's lagging, but it's direct.
That's poignant and a nice way to end things, because I think that's one of the main things that we struggle with the Indian Ocean region, as how do we see it as a region itself, not various subregions that are a part of it.
Yeah.
And the Gulf is usually the principal example of it's something exempt from the larger
Yeah.
region. And what you just said is, no, it is of the region because it fuels the region. And so,
Literally, yeah.
Right. So anyway, Dave, thank you so much both for your slides, the detail presented in them, and for your comments to my questions afterwards. We're going to end the recording now, but thank you again. And any questions that will come, I will direct them back to you, my friend.
It's an honor. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. It's an honor. Appreciate it. Thank you for your patience.